I'm about to tell you the literal worst kidnapping stories I could find on the internet. Starting off with the horrifying story of 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart, who spent 9 months kidnapped and chained up by a religious lunatic. The story begins on the night of June 5th, 2002. Elizabeth was sound asleep in her bed in the quiet, rich neighborhood of Federal Heights in Salt Lake City, Utah. She shared her bedroom with her younger sister, Mary Catherine. The house was silent, the family was resting peacefully without a care in the world. Then a faint noise broke the quiet. A window in the girl's room was forced open and a shadow crawled inside. A man carrying a knife moved across the room. Mary Catherine's eyes fluttering open. She froze, pretending to be asleep. The man approached Elizabeth's bed. A soft voice told her, "Don't make a sound, come with me or I'll hurt your family." Elizabeth, who was terrified, did as she was told. She slipped on her shoes and followed the man out of the house. Mary Catherine stayed frozen under her blankets this whole time. She heard everything. Now she listened helplessly as the strange man took her sister away. 2 hours passed before she found the courage to move. She ran to wake up her parents, her voice trembling as she told them, "Mom, Dad, someone took Elizabeth." Her father, Ed Smart, rubbed his eyes trying to process what he just heard. He told Mary Catherine that she must have just had a bad dream. But Mary Catherine insisted she was telling the truth. She begged them to come with her. So Ed and his wife Lois went to check the girls' room. And that's when they saw it. The window screen had been cut open. They froze in complete fear. Time was slipping away. Lois grabbed the phone and called the police immediately. By the time the police arrived, over 30 people had flooded the house because of the commotion. And because of this, they were contaminating any potential evidence. The police questioned Mary Catherine, who described the man as having dark hair and hairy arms. She also told them that his voice sounded somewhat familiar, though she couldn't place where she had heard it before. 3 hours after Elizabeth's abduction, the authorities activated the Rachel Alert System, named after another Utah girl who had been kidnapped and killed. The news broadcasted Elizabeth's disappearance to the public, urging everyone to be on the lookout. Meanwhile, the parents were going crazy trying to backtrack for any clues. Who could have it been? Ed and Lois racked their brains for answers. They tried to make a list of even the most far-fetched suspects. Their home had been on the market recently, so could the kidnapper have been someone who toured the house? The police investigated every lead, going through the list of potential visitors. They also searched the family's computer, looking for signs that Elizabeth might have been in contact with someone online. But unfortunately, leads would come up empty. The next day, Ed and Lois Smart went on national TV. Ed's voice shook with emotion as he begged the kidnapper to bring his daughter home. Tears filled his eyes as he promised to do anything to ensure her safe return. Lois, holding back tears, spoke directly to her daughter. "Elizabeth, if you can hear us, we love you," is what she said. The nation watched as the Smarts poured their hearts out. Meanwhile, detectives knocked on doors across Federal Heights. Not a single neighbor had seen or heard anything unusual the night Elizabeth disappeared. Ladies and boxheads, they were running out of options. And so the mayor of Salt Lake City, Rocky Anderson, announced that the city would pay a $10,000 reward for any information leading to Elizabeth's safe return. The city was alive with volunteers looking to help. But a day would pass and there was still no news. Then another, and then another. With each passing day, the stakes were getting higher. Within just a few days, the reward had skyrocketed to $250,000. And then that's where the search effort had just exploded. Nearly 1,200 volunteers searched the area, desperate to find any trace of the missing girl. Dogs sniffed the ground in the Red Butte Canyon. Airplanes droned overhead as 20 volunteer pilots searched from the skies. "Elizabeth, Elizabeth, where are you?" But nothing would turn up. Then one day, a Federal Heights milkman called the police. He had a tip. Okay, so he claimed to have seen an older gray car driving slowly through the neighborhood before the abduction. He said the car looked suspicious, so he quickly reached for a notepad and wrote down the license plate number. The police obviously got excited. They finally had something to work with. And so they quickly entered the number into their system and prepared to locate the perp. And guys, there was only one problem. This license plate number didn't exist. It was a dead end. Meanwhile, the stress of the search began to take a toll on the family. Ed Smart was out on his feet all day looking for his daughter, only coming home for short breaks and naps. Eventually, after a few days of getting absolutely no rest, he finally fainted from exhaustion. And so, ladies and boxheads, he was rushed to the hospital. But he refused to stay put. The doctors had a hard time keeping him in bed for more than a few hours, after which he was finally back on his feet, running out to look for Elizabeth. While the Smarts continued their efforts holding candlelight vigils, praying for their daughter's safe return, the police turned their attention to potential suspects. Suspect 1. Brett Michael Edmond. Witnesses reported seeing Brett in Federal Heights around the time of the abduction. The detectives set out to locate him, but the man was nowhere to be found. After several false sightings and tracking him across multiple states, the police finally found him in West Virginia. But it wasn't all good news. They found him hospitalized for an overdose and liver failure. Brett laid in critical condition. But luckily for everyone, he was alert enough to answer questions. The police conducted a thorough interview, but they had to clear him of any involvement because nothing suspicious came up. Suspect 2. With absolutely no new leads, the investigation turned to Richard Albert Ricci, a former handyman who had worked at the Smart home. Ricci had a grocery list of past offenses, including burglary, robbery, and even attempted murder. Ed Smart had hired Ricci the previous year, unaware of his past. Ricci had worked on the family's property in exchange for an old Jeep. When police questioned Ricci, he denied any involvement in Elizabeth's abduction. He also fully cooperated with the investigation. He didn't put up any fight. Like you would expect, Richard Ricci was under intense scrutiny. The police had conducted an exhaustive search of his home. They ransacked his house and even dug up his yard. He gave blood samples and he even sat through 26 hours of interviews. He even surrendered his own vehicle to the authorities. Despite their best efforts, nothing related to Elizabeth was found. And yet the authorities felt like there was something off with this guy. But then after, Richard Ricci was forced with theft and burglary. The charges came from incidents in the Federal Heights neighborhood, including one involving the Smart family's home. Ed Smart confronted Ricci about the alleged theft of the jewelry and a perfume bottle, hoping he was talking to the perpetrator. Somehow Ricci denied his involvement and the cops couldn't find anything on him, so they had to let him go. Then in August 2002, Ricci's story took a tragic turn. While in custody, Ricci suffered a brain aneurysm. He was rushed to the hospital where doctors performed an emergency surgery to remove a blood clot and reduce pressure on his brainstem. But ladies and boxheads, it was way too late. Ricci's condition kept getting worse. He lost his ability to speak, then he lost his ability to breathe on his own. After several days spent in pain, his family made the decision to remove him from life support. Ricci's death was a huge blow to the investigation. I mean, he was the prime suspect, and with him gone, the case was back to square one. As if these dead ends weren't frustrating enough, out came the opportunists looking to make some fast cash from the ongoing investigation. In November 2002, a dumbass from South Carolina named Walter Kenneth Holloway contacted the Smarts and the police claiming that he'd kidnapped Elizabeth. And the dumbass demanded $3 million for her safe return and threatened to hurt her if the money wasn't delivered. The police traced Holloway's location and immediately arrested him. The man clearly had no idea what he was doing. I mean, is he crazy? It didn't take long to figure out that Holloway was lying. I mean, he had no connection to Elizabeth whatsoever. And at this point, the investigation had begun to grow cold. Desperate for answers, detectives began turning to unconventional methods. No, seriously, it was time to trust the psychics. One psychic claimed Elizabeth's body was buried in a crypt in the foothills above Salt Lake City. Police followed the tips, searching the crypt and the surrounding areas. The only thing they could find was frustration, obviously. Other psychics insisted that she'd been killed within hours of her abduction and there was no way of finding her now. Like you would expect, this was going nowhere. The Smart family's hope was fading when a report came in, a potential breakthrough. A witness in Nebraska claimed to have seen a crying girl at a gas station. The description he gave fit Elizabeth almost perfectly. A girl between 12 and 14 years old sitting in a minivan and seemingly being held against her will. But after a thorough investigation, police found out that the sighting was unrelated. Once again, a lead that had turned into nothing. Then there was news of a crime in Salt Lake City. An 11-year-old girl was abducted from her bedroom, beaten, and sexually, When doctors examined her, they discovered that every single bone in the middle of her face had been broken. Police arrested a suspect, Javier Sickler, a close friend of the victim's father. Javier claimed to have blacked out during the attack. But the question still lies, could this man have also taken Elizabeth? The police got to work, but just days later, they'd concluded that Javier had no connection to her abduction. Guys, it had been 4 months since Elizabeth had disappeared. The parents began to question if she was even going to come back anymore. The house had basically turned into a wake. But then, this is where something amazing happened. There was finally a real breakthrough, and I'm so excited to end this story off with something positive. And it came from the most unexpected source, Elizabeth's little sister, Mary Catherine. In October 2002, as Mary Catherine was going around doing her daily chores, it finally struck her. Remember how she had a feeling that she knew the kidnapper's voice? Well, in that exact moment, she realized who it was. It was Emmanuel. Emmanuel was an unemployed man her dad had hired to help with the roof repairs and with raking leaves. He had worked for the family for just one single day. She had her parents call the police immediately, but like you would expect, I think there was a little bit of hesitation. This was a child's claim after all. I mean, Emmanuel had only worked at the house for a short period of time. Could Mary Catherine's memory be accurate after so many months? Maybe she was imagining things because she really wanted her sister back. But there were no other solid leads coming in, so the police decided, why not? Let's give this a shot. A sketch artist created a drawing based on Mary Catherine's description of Emmanuel. The sketch was released to the public in February 2003. Emmanuel instantly became a wanted man. Within days, someone recognized the man in the drawing. His real name was not Emmanuel. It was Brian David Mitchell. And that's the man the police were now looking for. On March 12, 2003, two couples in Sandy, Utah spotted Mitchell walking with a woman and a young girl. The girl was wearing a headscarf and sunglasses, but the couples felt certain it was Elizabeth. They called the police. Officers arrived quickly, but they questioned the trio. The little girl even gave a false name, Esther. But something felt unnatural in the way that she was behaving, and so they continued to ask her questions. The police had a suspicion she was lying. Clearly, she was scared of Mitchell and the woman with him. As the questions continued, the officers promised her that she was in safe hands. And finally, she admitted the truth. They had found Elizabeth Smart after 9 months in captivity. Elizabeth, the brave little girl, was finally ready to tell her story of the 9 months spent in captivity. From, well, the very beginning. The night she was abducted, Mitchell had led her to a hidden camp in the mountains outside Salt Lake City. There, she met his wife, Wanda Barzy. At first, Barzy acted like a mom. She offered emotional support and warmth. But as the days turned into weeks, she became less kind. Mitchell and Barzy were followers of some strange kind of religion, and they threatened to hit Elizabeth if she didn't follow their religious rituals. Mitchell declared himself a Davidic king, claiming he was commanded by God to abduct virgin brides. He said that Elizabeth was going to be the first of his many partners in his fight against the Antichrist, and so she was forced to marry Mitchell in a sham ceremony. That's when the worst of it began. Mitchell stripped her of any sense of identity by telling her that her name was now Esther. He then went on to repeatedly assault her, saying that it was all a part of his divine mission. Elizabeth was tied to a tree with a metal cable. Every day from then onwards, she was forced to drink alcohol, take drugs, and read explicit magazines. She was also starved and fed scraps. And Mitchell would visit her multiple times a day to hurt her. She thought she was gonna die. On the day she was rescued, her nightmare had finally ended. After their arrest, Barzy pleaded guilty to her role in the abduction and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 2018, she was released early, despite protests from Elizabeth herself, who claimed that she was one of the most evil women she had ever met. Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison. During his sentencing, Elizabeth faced him one last time. She said, "You took away 9 months of my life, but you will never take away my future." Okay, ladies and boxheads, I'm going to include some links to Elizabeth herself recounting the story. Seriously, she is one brave woman. And I wish I could say that this video didn't get any worse, but now let me tell you about the next story. The Chowchilla kidnapping. This is the story of how a school bus driver and 27 school children were buried alive in a failed kidnapping attempt. Yeah, it was July 15th, 1976. Ed Ray, a 55-year-old school bus driver in Chowchilla, California, started his usual afternoon route. 19 girls and 7 boys aged 5 to 14 years old. I mean, they were all excited, they were chatting, they were shouting. It was the second to last day of summer school. Ed Ray has been driving kids around Chowchilla for over 20 years. They loved him and he loved them back. Many of their parents and grandparents had even been his classmates growing up. But on this day, Ed's life and theirs would change forever. Ed was driving down a quiet, rural road under the burning hot California sun. Up ahead, something caught his eye. A white van stopped dead in the middle of the road. Ed frowned. He slowed the bus, looking for the van's driver. Was it broken down? Ed brought the bus to a stop, unaware that there was another van hidden nearby. Then the doors of the first van swung open. 3 men jumped out. Their faces were obscured by pantyhose, stretched tight like grotesque masks. Before Ed could react, one man stormed onto the bus and pressed the cold barrel of a gun to Ed's temple. Move. The man ordered, his voice cold and calm. Ed's heart was racing, but he decided to obey. Ed stepped away from the driver's seat, and one of the masked men took over. The 2 other gunmen turned to the children. The bus went silent except for the muffled crying of a few terrified kids. The man at the wheel steered the bus off the road into a dry canal. The once familiar landscape disappeared behind them. Inside the bus, things were getting tense. Some of the younger kids didn't fully understand what was happening. 5-year-old Monica Artery stared curiously at one of the men. The legs of the pantyhose on his head hung down like floppy rabbit ears. "Are you the Easter Bunny?" Her small voice cutting through the silence. Even in this nightmarish moment, Ed felt his stomach twist. This poor girl had no idea what was happening, but thankfully the gunmen ignored her. They didn't cause any problems for her. Then at the canal, the gunman ordered Ed and the children off the bus. "Out!" Ed hesitated. The man raised his gun and Ed quickly followed the orders, helping the kids off the bus one by one. The dry canal floor was burning hot under their feet. 2 white vans sat, waiting. The gunmen grouped their victims together and shoved them into the backs of the vans. Ed tried to count the kids. His mind was racing. He needed to keep track of every single one of the kids. 1, 2, 3. The van doors were slammed shut, sealing Ed and the children inside the darkness. It was dead quiet and he couldn't see a damn thing. When his eyes adjusted to the pitch darkness, he saw the seats had been removed from the van, leaving only the bare metal floor. There was no food, no water, and the drivers didn't stop for anything. For the next 11 hours, the 2 vans rumbled ahead. The kids, cramped together, were now getting nauseous from the bumpy ride. Some of the younger kids had begun to throw up, while the other kids tried to keep them calm. One of them even suggested they sing to lighten the mood. Their voices trembled as they sang. "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands." Except they weren't happy, not even close. So they changed the words of the song. "If you're sad and you know it, clap your hands." The song faltered as some of the kids broke into tears. Ed sat in silence, helpless and overwhelmed. He had no idea how to help them when he was freaking out himself. He checked his watch over and over, marking the hours. It was 3:30 in the morning when the vans finally stopped. The doors opened and a harsh light flooded in. "Out!" The gunmen yanked the doors open and dragged their captives out, one by one. The group had been brought back to a rock quarry in Livermore, California, nearly 100 miles away from Chowchilla. Ed squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Under the faint glow of the quarry lights, something strange stood out. A van, but not just any van. This one was somehow buried underground, with only the roof and a small opening visible above the dirt. Ed began to wonder how someone could even have accomplished that. Then one of the gunmen shoved Ed forward. snapping him back to reality. "Name! Name! Name!" Another barked at the kids, forcing each one of them to say their names as they each handed over one piece of their clothing. The items were tossed into a pile. Ed's heart sank. Were they going to bury them alive? One by one, the kidnappers ordered the children down a ladder through the roof of the buried van. The older kids went first, helping the younger ones climb down into the darkness. Then it was Ed's turn. The space inside was cramped and dark. Dirty mattresses lined the floor along with a few jugs of water and boxes of food, if you could even call it that. Once everyone was inside, the kidnappers slammed a steel plate over the roof's opening. Ed felt his stomach drop. Then came the sound of dirt being shoveled. One scoop at a time, they were being buried alive. The younger kids start screaming. One child even fainted. Ed tried to calm them down, but his own panic was taking over. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. But the walls of the van seemed to close in around them. Ed was fighting back tears in his own eyes. Ladies and boxheads, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could protect the kids he cared for so much. Buried underground in the pitch darkness of the van, Ed Ray stared at the steel roof above him. His heart was pounding. He was sure of one thing: the roof wouldn't hold out for too long. Dirt was piling on top of the steel plate and the weight was slowly starting to press inward. The air inside was hot and suffocating. Ed looked around at the terrified faces of the 26 children huddled in the buried van. They were crying, shivering, and clinging on to each other. Then, suddenly, 14-year-old Mike Marshall had suddenly stood up. It went quiet in the van, all eyes were on him. He looked like he had something to say. He took a deep breath, put on a brave voice, and then loudly announced to all the other kids that he wasn't going to just sit here and die without trying. Seeing this, Ed's own spirits were suddenly lifted. He had to believe he could get out of there for anything to happen. And so he quickly came up with a plan. Ed and Mike got to work. He told the older boys to help him gather the dirty mattresses scattered across the van. Together, they stacked the mattresses on top of one another, creating a makeshift tower that reached the roof. Ed held the stack steady as Mike climbed to the top. The kids below passed him wooden slats from the broken bed frames inside the van. "Push as hard as you can," Ed told him. Mike jammed the slats into the edges of the steel plate covering the roof, but the plate would not budge. Ed climbed up to help. He quickly realized that it was being weighed down by something extremely heavy. This something would later turn out to be 2 massive tractor batteries, weighing about 100 pounds each. The weight was crushing. Ed's arms were beginning to throb. He was getting tired. His muscles screamed in protest as he pushed against the plate with all of his strength. Sweat poured down his face. The kids below passed water up to him and Mike, trying to keep them from collapsing from the heat. For hours they pushed. The roof continued to sag further and further, the weight of the dirt pressing even closer. Then, just as hope was starting to fade, the plate shifted. Dirt spilled down into the van as Ed and Mike finally broke through. A gap appeared in the roof. Ed quickly lifted one of the older boys through the hole and told him to start clearing away the dirt. One by one, the children were lifted through the opening and out of the buried van. Finally, the last child climbed out and the older boys reached back down to pull Ed up. 16 hours after being buried alive, Ed and the children emerged into the early morning light. They were gasping for fresh air, trembling but still alive. The group stumbled toward a quarry guard shack near the Shadow Cliffs East Bay Regional Park. Inside, a very confused night watchman stared at the disheveled group. 26 children and one exhausted bus driver. What on earth happened? Ed told him to call the police immediately. We were kidnapped. When police arrived, like you would imagine, they were stunned. Officers were quickly dispatched to the quarry, where they found the buried moving van. Peering inside, they saw the dirty mattresses, empty water jugs, and discarded food containers. The sight sent chills down their spines. Investigators immediately began piecing together the details. One thing was for sure clear. The kidnappers had to be people who had access to the quarry. The moving van had been carefully buried, and the operation would have taken significant time and effort. Their first lead was the quarry owner's son, 24-year-old Frederick Newhall Woods IV. Frederick was well known in the area. Police quickly learned that he spent an unusual amount of time at the quarry. Within days, they tracked down Frederick and his two accomplices, brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld. The trio was arrested, and that's when all the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. 3 perpetrators, all coming from rich families, but had somehow managed to fall into a lot of debt. Desperate for money, they came up with this horrifying plan: kidnap a bus full of children and then demand a ransom. In custody, James explained their twisted logic. They needed multiple victims to get multiple millions. And they picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay ransom for them. They don't fight back, they were just vulnerable. The trio had been inspired by a short story called The Day the Children Vanished by Hugh Pentecost. They had stumbled upon it in a book at the local library. Jackpot. The trio had studied the book over and over to make sure they didn't miss anything. They thought they had just cracked the perfect crime. But when they finally went out to test it, their plan fell apart almost immediately. The kidnappers had planned to demand a $5 million ransom from the state. But as luck would have it, the phone lines at the Chowchilla Police Department were jammed with calls from worried parents. They just couldn't get through, so the kidnappers had decided to wait. By the time they saw the news, it was way too late. Ed Ray and the children had escaped, and their faces were plastered all over national television. The dumbass trio's grand plan had failed. At trial, Frederick, James, and Richard all pleaded guilty to charges of kidnapping for ransom and robbery. They were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Over the years, the kidnappers went in different directions. Richard Schoenfeld was paroled in 2012. James Schoenfeld followed in 2015. Frederick Woods, the dumbass fourth, considered the ringleader, remains in prison to this day. Haha, that puts a smile on my face. Anyways, on August 22nd, 1976, just over 1 month after the escape, Chowchilla held a celebration for Ed Ray. The children and their families gathered to thank the man who had saved their lives. Although Ed Ray and the children survived, the trauma from this incident lasted for decades. And sadly, many of the children developed severe anxiety, panic attacks, and reoccurring nightmares. And look guys, I wish I could really say this was the craziest kidnapping I've ever heard of, but in this video right here, I talk about a victim who was held captive for 18 years before finally escaping.